Osio Nigad, Dohiju. Hi guys, how you doing? Osio is how we say hello in Cherokee, or just CEO. Hi. Nigad, friends gathered together. Dohiju means how are you doing? And if you're doing good, you say Os. I am Gayle Ross, and I am an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And as you heard, I'm a direct descendant of Chief John Ross. You may be able to tell by looking at me that I am mixed blood Cherokee. My dad was Cherokee, my mother was not. My mother was a drop-dead gorgeous Alabama Southern belle. But that's a whole different set of stories. I come from a long line of mixed blood Cherokees. Chief Ross was the son of a quarter blood woman named Molly McDonald and a Scots fur trader named Daniel Ross. Molly was the daughter of a half-breed woman named Anne Shorey and a Scots fur trader named John McDonald. And Anne was the daughter of a full-blood woman named Giguli and a Scots fur trader named William Shorey. Much has been written about the relationship between the Highland Scots and the Cherokee people. Many of the first traders licensed by the Crown that came in to live with the Cherokee were Highland Scots. And I think when you hear it said that they got along really well because the Highlanders came from the strong classes, that's true. They said the Cherokees and the Scots got along so well because they came from a strong warrior tradition, as did the Cherokee. If you've seen Outlander, you know that's true. I think it was different. They were traders. They had pots and pans. Made them infinitely attractive to Cherokee women. Chief Ross married a full-blood woman. Her name was Quakey or Betty. She died on the trail. She's buried in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they had a son named Alan. And Alan married Jenny Fields, a woman who was 3/4 Cherokee by blood. And they had a son named Robert Bruce, who married a Cherokee woman named Fanny Daniels Thornton, also 3/4 Cherokee by blood. And their youngest daughter was my grandmother Anne. So whenever the inevitable question comes up, how much Cherokee are you? I tell people what I just told you and see if they want to do the math. Never my strong suit. I know what it says on my card, but they shaved a little bit of my quantum when they issued me my card. Now, unlike my grandmother, who grew up in Park Hill, what is now Park Hill, Oklahoma, which is the heart of the Cherokee Nation. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But my dad, right after World War II, he and his mother, my grandmother Anne, came down to the Dallas-Fort Worth area for Dad to go to college on the GI Bill. So I was born and raised in what my Cherokee friends like to call Baja, Oklahoma, Texas. My great aunt Jen, my grandmother Ann's sister, was the first Indian woman professional photographer, Jen Ross. And she had opened a photography studio in Arlington. And so after the end of World War II, Grandmother Anne and my dad, freshly back from the Pacific, where he served in the Navy as a radio man on a destroyer, They came and moved in with my great aunt Jen there in Arlington, Texas. And my dad enrolled on the GI Bill at what was then North Texas Agricultural College. And there he met a freshman named Beth Johnson, who, as earlier referred to, was drop dead gorgeous. And my father began to date this beautiful young woman, but he had a lot of competition. And he didn't feel like he was making a good enough impression on her. So when the spring semester began, my mother was her sorority's nominee for Valentine. So my dad, who had been flying and crashing airplanes from his teens, he sent one down to my great aunt Jen's, Georgia, and when she found out he was okay, she nearly beat him to death for taking out 2 of her trees. But at this point, he and a few friends had gone in on an old rust bucket, and he was supplementing his income by crop dusting. And so he came up with what he thought was a brilliant idea to impress my mother. He put 50 cents worth of gas in his plane. The rest he spent printing up flyers that said, "Vote for Beth Johnson for Valentine." And he went up and came down over campus, right down through the main quad, pulled his lever, hundreds, maybe even thousands of flyers, blanketed with him. One problem. A biology professor looked down on his wing from the 3rd story window of the science building, wrote down his numbers, and turned his skinny Indian ass in. He lost his pilot's license for 6 months. He was thrown out of North Texas Agricultural College, but he married mine. Like I said, my mother was from Alabama. My mom's whole side of the family came from a little town well south of Selma called Evergreen. Evergreen, Alabama was the heart of the South. Ask them, they'll tell you even today. And like I said, my grandmother had grown up in Park Hill, which is right outside Tahlequah, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation. But they settled down in Arlington. And my dad went to work first for the Dallas Police Department, but then he had always loved to fly. He had been literally flying planes from the time he was 15. And an opening came up with a young little airline called Green. So my brother was born in 1950. I was born in 1951. My sister was born in 1953. My other sister was born in 1954. I know. Every time we kid Mom about, didn't you figure out what caused that? He would say, which one of you do you want me to put back? But my point is that even though I grew up with a strong family identification, because my grandmother lived with our family, and she was the family historian, and from all reports, an amazing storyteller. Before she married the general, my dad's father was the general, which is how I came to be in the Navy. because he ran away from, they had stashed him, they thought, safely in a military school in Georgia when the war broke out. And he ran away and was headed to Canada and wanted to go across the line, join the RAF. And his mother caught up with him just south of the border. Just so the second time he ran away, he joined the Navy. He figured he would be much less conspicuous in the Navy, with his father being fairly well-known Brigadier General M.W. Piper. So he joined the Navy. And when I grew up, the only thing that I knew really was the family history and the stories that my grandmother told. Dad bought this big old place out on Lake Grapevine, and grandmother lived with us, and she was the youngest of 9 children. And really all of that generation, and the one that came after it, my dad's generation, had moved all over the country. So whenever relatives were crisscrossing, they would stop at our house and visit. And it became, I was a child, I believed that the best stories are not heard, they're overheard. So I would hide and be inconspicuous in the living room because I could listen to her talk forever. And as I grew up, that identification with family and history and stories, my dad said my grandmother knew hundreds of stories. It was my very slender, and I didn't know how slender at the time, connection to Cherokee heritage and culture, because I wasn't growing up going to the stomp grounds, going to hog fries, going to gospel sings. But I had that deep love in my heart for our history. Anytime an argument would break out about anything from the Trail of Tears to the Civil War, about what had happened when, my grandmother was go-to, the last word on history and culture. And as I grew older, I began to seek out ways to learn more. And I say that's important because you have to map your interior landscape. You have to look hard and true and well at what would a spirit suddenly landing in your interior world, what would they look around and what would they see? What would they recognize? What would they not? So for a long, long time, I was just somebody who loved story, loved history. The first time I told a story to an audience that wasn't my brother and my sisters and my cousins was the 4th grade. And it happened because I forgot my homework. You know, I didn't make up the story about why I didn't have my homework that time. But now some of you look old enough in this room to remember this particular form of torture. Remember when they used to make us memorize long poems? And you had to stand up in front of the class and recite your poem. Things like "There's strange things done in the midnight sun, but one go. The Arctic trails have seen strange tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights. Queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge when I cremated Sam McGee." Things like that. But I got to class that day and I remembered that I forgot to memorize a poem. But I'm a quick thinker. When I'm in trouble, I stood up and said, I chose not to memorize a poem. Instead, I will share with you an ancient, traditional story of mine. And the teacher fell for it. So I told a story I heard my grandmother tell about a trick that Rabbit, and we'll get to him later, had played on Possum that makes Possum have that long, naked, ugly tail. And when you get to say naked tail out loud to a room full of fourth graders, you're going to be a big hit. So for a long time, I was just that kid on the camp out who could tell you why the North Star stood still, or the kid at the slumber party who knew the best ghost stories. And after I got thrown out of the University of Texas at Arlington, which was the aforesaid North Texas Agricultural College, I went to work telling stories on the radio. I was a newscaster. And I bombed around the media world for a while. I went from one radio station in Dallas down to Austin to work at a TV station, and then to an FM radio. But you know, those stories never had happy endings. And the radio station always stayed in one place. And beginning in my early days in Dallas, I was pulled into connecting with Indian community. That's what I mean by mapping my interior landscape. I started off on a journey that would literally grow a whole big environment from which the stories draw when they come through me. I first joined the Dallas urban Indian community because I happened to pick an apartment in Oak Cliff. You may not realize this, but the federal government has been trying to get rid of Indians for a long time. Long time. And one of the things they came up with was the urban relocation program, where they went to reservations where there was a sizable community of people who were probably living on the edge of poverty. You can still see some of those places today. And they would tell these wonderful stories of what life would be like in the big city. You could get a good home and a good job. And, you know, sometimes people were hard enough up to think, well, this might be a way to make a better life for my family. But essentially what they did was create big Indian ghettos in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Dallas. You may have heard of a Cherokee woman named Wilma Mankiller, Principal Chief Mankiller. In her biography, she writes her father, John. They took the entire family to San Francisco. And so she grew up there, which is how she thought was mapping her interior landscape and found herself at Alcatraz. Really good time. So yeah, the first Indian community that I connected with was not my own Cherokee community, it was an intertribal. And this is true of a lot of urban Indian families, now third, fourth generation, that have grown up with what they call powwow culture, which is a culture that is made up of contributions from many different tribes. And for a while, that was enough. You know, everywhere I went, there was an urban tribe that I could connect with. And then in 1978, I left media by this time, and I was traveling around the country with a couple of musician friends of mine, taking care of their small daughter. And Elizabeth Ellis, a good friend of mine, worked at Dallas Public Library. We became good friends as a part of the support audience for a big, awesome Texas music renaissance that was happening in the 1970s. And Elizabeth was such a gifted storyteller that Dallas Public Library created. She was just a children's librarian, but they created this position of storyteller in all caps because Elizabeth was so good at what she did. And in 1978, she took me to a small festival in this beautiful little mountain town of Jonesboro, Tennessee. She wanted to leave Dallas Public and start telling as a freelance seller. And I had no idea any of this even existed, but she knew I knew Cherokee stories. And so we went to Jonesboro in 1978. So many wonderful people. Some of whom are still the elders of the community today, and some of whom who have traveled on. But she talked to me all the way back to Dallas, where she lived. And the upshot of it was I quit traveling with my musician friends, and she quit the Dallas Public Library, and we started off as a duo telling stories. We both thought that on some level, the traditional stories of the original people from the mountains and her Appalachian mountain tales that she grew up with, it would be kind of a reconciliation on some levels for the two of us to work together. And you know, once I started telling stories professionally, I was really young compared to a lot of people. And I had a youthful enthusiasm, but you know, I didn't really have a completely well-developed brain. You know what I mean? I was telling as a Cherokee teller, but without the foundation of traditional Cherokee culture. And I made a lot of mistakes. I would just think, well, I'll just find another Indian tale. I was learning, you know, stories as fast as I could to keep up with this, with my responsibility as half of this duo. And I never stopped to question whether or not those people would want their stories walking around in this interior landscape. They probably wouldn't recognize a thing. They'd see a blinking red traffic stoplight, not the hills or the plains or the deserts of where the spirit of that story is. I was really lucky though, because one after another, as I followed this path, the people came into my life to help me learn what I needed to learn. And one of the first was an amazing Lakota writer. Time magazine once called him one of the 10 great religious thinkers of the world. He was by profession a professor at a college, but he published over and over and over. His name was Vine the Glorious June. And if you haven't read God is Bread, Custer Died for Your Sins, my favorite, Metaphysics for Modern Existence, which is publishing company wanted him to change the title because it didn't say anything. And he just recently, one of his books, The Way We Used to Live, has been made into an audiobook. Look for it online. And it's read by the incredible Cherokee actor Wes Stevens. You would enjoy anything of Vine's, but that audiobook is something really spectacular. And Vine very gently helped me understand that the Lakota people did not want me telling the Buffalo Captain story. That story is told at Sunday. You haven't forfeited some skin for the game. You have no reason telling that story. And he gently pointed me to a literary tale by John G. Nyhart, whose best friend for years and years was Lame Deer. And so the relationship of those two people resulted in Nyhart writing a novelized version of their relationship, White Rider to Lakota, respective medicine. And then I got, yeah, really, my mother thought it would never happen. I was 29. And Elizabeth's children were growing older, and she was free to travel more. We had always had to do our bookings around what her kids needed. And I was just getting married and starting my family. I couldn't travel as much. And so in 1982, we set off as solo tour. And the responsibility that came with that as a solo tradition keeper, tradition bearer, made everything I was learning so much more important. And I was, my husband and I were driving back to Texas from Chicago. And I said, I want to stop in town. There's this house there. And when I was very young, my grandmother and my great aunt Jan, they were the ones who oversaw the restoration of the home. And it was bought by the state and made into a museum. And my great aunt Jen was the first curator. I want to see what I have memories. I was so small. I have memories of it just being this gigantic mansion. We really need to go see if it's still there. And so we arrived in Parkville and drove to what is called the Merle home. Although they changed the name again, it's called Hunter's Home. And it was beautiful, but it wasn't like, it was just a big house, you know. But it was the only antebellum plantation house that survived the Civil War in the Cherokee Nation. And it was the house that Great Aunt Jen and grandmother had grown up. And when I walked, I mean, first of all, looking at it brought all these memories flooding back to me. The way my older brother, when we would wade in the creek out back, would find leeches and drop them down my shirt. You know, other really charming family memories like that. But I walked into the door, straight into the arms of my cousin, Bruce Ross. Bruce is my dad's first cousin, but he's only a few years older than me. His father was my grandmother's older brother, and he had not had children until late, like in his 60s. He married a young woman named Marguerite. So when my dad who was the youngest of that slew of cousins born to the 9, my grandmother was the youngest of 9 children. He could literally freak people out by telling them that his grandfather fought in the Civil War. And he's right, but that's because there's such a gap in between Bruce and my dad. But he knew who I was. He remembered me. And he started facilitating all these ways for me to come back and spend time there and meet other members of the family. He took me to the stomp grounds. He took me to our annual powwow. He came down to Texas and stayed with me and Reed, and he was his generation's historian and storyteller, which came with the job as curator at the Merle Home. So I learned about the stories of the people in each of those generations that I told you about at first. Now, I made it kind of into a funny joke, but Indian people in the audience recognize that I'm introducing myself. You don't know who you are. You don't know who your family is, and you don't know how they live. For example, Bruce's great grandparents, my father's grandparents, Robert Bruce Ross, was born right after the Trail of Tears. But of course, his father, Alan, and he knew his grandfather, Chief Ross. So he grew up with people who actually experienced that. When the Civil War came, many people don't know that the Civil War was as devastating for Indian territory as it was for the North and South. They see only black, white, blue, and gray. But our country was devastated. The Cherokees split into 2 factions, just as they had at the time of the Trail of Tears. So when Cherokee fought Cherokee, it was devastation that ripped from up and down, because it mostly considered their contribution to the war in a lot of ways was just this violent guerrilla fighting that went on between Union Cherokee and Confederate Cherokee. Now, Robert Bruce was 17 when the war broke out, and he, with his father and his uncles, joined the Union Indian Home, 3rd Indian Home Guard, and he fought for the Union. And at the end of the war, he met a young Confederate Cherokee woman named Fanny Daniels Thornton. And they married at the close of the Civil War, and their first child was born in 1870, and their last, my grandmother, was born in 1892. Consider that. 22 years of child care. I have 2 kids. That's because my feet were half the size of each child. And I couldn't let them get any. When my grandmother and my great aunt Jan were at the turn of the century, they convinced their mother, Miss Fanny, to dictate to them her Civil War experience. She was, as I said, a Confederate. And she wrote them all down about how they refugeed to Arkansas and how the lines of battle swept back and forth over them. And when they were cut off from their Confederate husbands and other Confederate battalions, how they would knit mufflers and gloves and wrap them around parts of their body and apply for a pass from the Union Army to pass through the lines down to their Confederate brothers, husbands, sons. And she was arrested as a spy because they thought she was smuggling information. And when a Christmas party was held by one of the Confederate generals, Miss Fanny wrote very proudly that she was one of only 3 Indian girls who were invited. And she got to the party and the general was wearing a muffler around his neck that she had knitted. And she spent the evening amusing herself by wondering what he would think if he knew where it had been. Yes, that was ritzy stuff, you know, for that time. And she closed out her memoir by saying that they had refugees. She lost a lot of members of her family. She was so sick she nearly died. It was a Union doctor who saved her. But they refugeed back to Tahlequah and camped at a place called Ross Springs. And she looked up one day and she, in her words, she saw the old chief's grandson riding down toward her. And she wrote, I knew I was looking at the man I would marry. She said he went north and I went south. But in the map of the heart, there is no south. So these are the kind of stories that I began learning. I knew more about my family. More opportunities were coming. The Cherokee Heritage Center started hiring me to come up and tell stories. The principal chief, Chad Smith, in 1999 started asking me to come up and teach storytelling to the kids at our high school, Sequoia. And I joined the Stomp Ground. And then 12 years ago, Chief Smith asked me to go to work full time for the nation. And, you know, I'd spent my whole life traveling around telling stories mostly to non-native audiences. I mean, after all these years of growing things, my interior landscape was now Cherokee. And I became the person that I needed to be a true guardian and caretaker for these stories. And so that's how we all moved up from Texas to the Cherokee Nation. It's a reservation again. Thank you, Supreme Court. Can you believe this Supreme Court and GERT found that our reservations had never been disestablished? We knew that. And so my husband and I bought 10 acres and I live in the heart of the Cherokee Nation. I lost my husband 3 years ago, but he loved that place as much as I do, so I know it's good all the time. But as I began to learn from other Cherokee storytellers, from people at the grounds, I became ever more aware of the responsibilities that we carry. And a lot of them, no matter where the geography is, that's where you're going to start, with where you were born and raised and the relationships that you might have had with that landscape. But really important are connecting with those who came before you. I mean, I can rattle off all those generations and make it funny, but they're also real people now, because I know their stories. I know how they live. And that informs every choice I make as a storyteller. It means every Cherokee story I learn finds themselves in an interior landscape of mine that is familiar. And it's literally, it's not that, hard. It only took me 38 years, and all of that is just so I wanted you to understand. That's why when Alice and Ann said I was going to do a keynote, that I thought, I think I'd like to share a little bit more than just telling the stories. Hi, little birdie. Not just G-Stew's rabbit. That's what I'm fixing to tell the story about. Stories for young people. These are the stories for young people. One of the first stories I learned was the one about rabbit and possum. Rabbit's very important to us. G-Stew. G-Stew, at the beginning days of the world, when all creatures spoke the same language, G-Stew was always in trouble. He is that troublemaker, that trickster, who can only make himself feel smart when he's making you feel stupid, and he talks all the time. That's the other reason he was in trouble. He never stopped talking. He'd talk, he'd talk, he'd talk, he'd take a deep breath, he'd talk some more. And then the creator came along, scooped him up, said, G-Stew, you don't listen. I'm gonna help you listen better. Took a hold of Rabbit's ears. That's how come they stick up like that. But it didn't matter. He still didn't. And he still talked too much. But that's how he got his job. They made him the messenger for the Animal Tribal Council. They figured he was going to be jogging anyway. They might as well give him something to say. So it was his job to be there at the council house for every animal council meeting. This is the Animal Tribal Council, by the way. We believe in the beginning days of the world, all the original animals, birds, all the original people, they were much bigger, much more perfect than their modern day descendants, because at one and the same at time, over the passage of time, many of the originals people had moved back into the sky vault where they came from, and all we have are their descendants. And the original society, animal society, was organized very much like perfect society, Cherokee society. They had animal stickball games. Stickball is our national sport. The modern day descendant of the lacrosse. They had dances. They had stomp dances like we did, and they had a tribal council like we did. Now, Eagle was the speaker of the council, the boss. And on one Saturday, beautiful early summer, blue sky, all the smells of the fresh green and growing things. And there was a council meeting going on in the council house. So Rabbit was there, waiting for them to finish, so he could go and do his job. Now, there was going to be a stomp dance that night. Rabbit loves dances. Free food, free girls. So he had his rattle with him. And he thought, while he waited for them to finish, he'd sing a little, loosen up his voice, get ready for the dance. He's a good caller. He's always welcome to the dances. So he made him up a little song. And since he got to make up the song, it was about what he liked most, rabbit. He sang, "G-2, not the play. G-2, not the play." Second verse. G-2, adoptee. G-2, adoptee. Any idea what you're singing? You're very trusting people. G-2, rabbit, rabbit. Not coming. What's that sound? G-2, rabbit, rabbit, he is here. What's it sound? It's this sound of my glorious. And the louder he sang, the better he felt. And the better he felt, the louder he sang. Until finally, inside the council house, they couldn't hear themselves think. Eagle looked down at the sergeant at arms, that's Bullfrog. He said, "You go out there. You tell that fool I said to be quiet." Bullfrog didn't get very much work as the enforcer because most everybody in the council were fairly polite, well-mannered. So he was excited. He puffed himself up as big as he could. He popped outside. There's Rabbit singing, shaking his rattle. Bullfrog jumped up, knocked the rattle out of Rabbit's hand. Rabbit stopped singing, looked down. Bullfrog looked up at him and said, "Eagle says, be quiet. Be quiet." And he hopped back inside. Rabbit watched him go and said, "Cute little fella. Do not the sing. Do not the Inside the council house, Eagle looked down and said, Bullfrog, and said, "Oh yeah, good job. You showed him." Fox, you go out there. You make him be quiet. So Fox goes out there. There's Rabbit shaking his rattle and singing. Fox reached out, grabbed Rabbit's right hand and chopped it off. I totally give this back to you. Like when the council meeting is like totally over. And she stuck Rabbit's arm in her pocket and headed back inside. Rabbit watched her go. When the door closed behind her, he said, "Peace do not the Peace do not the Peace do not the Inside the council house, Eagle said, "Somebody bigger than Fox. Wolf, you go out there. You make him be quiet." So Wolf goes out there, there's Rabbit shaking his rattle, singing. Wolf reached out, grabbed his left arm and topped it off. Boo. Eagle said, "Give it back to you after the meeting." And he stuffed Rabbit's arm in his pocket, headed back inside. Rabbit watched him go. When the door closed behind him, he said, cheese stew, not okay. Cheese stew, not okay. Cheese stew, hot dog. Cheese stew, hot dog. Inside the council house, Eagle said, Bear, you go out there. You make him be quiet. So Bear went out there. There's Rabbit singing, keeping time with his foot. Bear reached out, grabbed both his legs, chopped him off. Rabbit fell to the ground. Bear said, "I'll give these back to you when the council meeting is over." And he stuck Rabbit's legs in his pocket, headed back inside. Rabbit's lying there on the ground, watching the clouds go by. After a while, he says, cheese stew, not day. Cheese stew, not day. Cheese stew, hot dog. Cheese stew, hot dog. He's singing, keeping time with his head. And inside the council house, Eagle says, "That's it. If you want something done right, gotta do it yourself." So Eagle goes out there. There's Rabbit lying on the ground, singing, keeping time with his head. Eagle reached down, grabbed Rabbit's head, and topped it off. "I'll give this back to you when the council meeting is." And he stuffed Rabbit's head in his pocket, headed back inside. But the door had barely closed when they heard very keep do, not thing. They couldn't believe it. Everybody rushed outside. They gathered around that little furry jelly bean shaped looking thing lying on the ground. Eagle put his head down and listened. And then he looked up at the others and he said, "He's singing with his heart." "Aw," said Bear. He took out Rabbit's legs, popped them back on, stood him up. Fox and Wolf put his arms back. Eagle popped his head back, and they handed him his rabbit. You see, the all-wise, all-important Congress, when I say that, Animal Tribal Council, had learned a lesson from that silly rat. And I hope it's what you will remember whenever you think of this story. You have a voice. You have a voice. And there are so many ways that you are a voice in this world. What you say, the way you treat, where you choose to participate in economic realities. I call it voting with the dollar. The ways that you think of this community that you live in. Your vote is your voice. And I hope every single one of you will make your voice heard next Tuesday. So remember that silly rat. Lend your voice only to the truth. Let it come from your heart. And they can take you apart one piece at a time, and they'll never silence your voice. Deep, 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 not that face. 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 Wonderful, thank you. Or one.
Please send her the story if you want.
Do you want another?
Yeah.
Well, it took a long path to get here, but I hope it, I know, I just hope it will make you maybe think a little bit about all the different ways, that your presence on the planet can make contribution. The more that you connect with the people and the places that help shape you, even in ways you may not even recognize. I knew there was something to genetic memory the very first time that I drove back to the Smoky Mountains. I was literally that crazy. I mean, I'm talking hanging off suspension bridges by one, holding on by one foot while I shot film of the fall colors going up a mountain stream. I just knew, I knew where I was. I knew that that was a part of me. And yet, of course, I had never experienced it before. And for those who tell stories professionally, I draw two very different levels of responsibility. If you are a teacher or a librarian or a daycare worker or somebody else in that, I hope you will tell stories from many different cultures, histories from many different peoples. And that's why I publish. I hope that you will be careful to use material that comes from Native people themselves. We have so many wonderful Native speakers, Native poets, Native writers, and yet exploitation of our culture and appropriation of our culture is something that hurts people a lot, and it takes a lot of different forms. I can't tell you how many times I stood in front of the kindergarten class wearing cardboard feathers, headdresses that they had cut out and painted. And the teacher was like, yeah, dress them up just like you. I'm like, you shouldn't. No, really. You shouldn't. How many times do you, at Halloween, do you see these hypersexualized Indian maiden costumes? Our little girls look at that and go, what the actual? And then depending on how well you grace them, choose it. We have to be seen. We can't be thought of as only from the past. People with romantic ideas of caring for the environment. It's more than that. It's actual Indian science that guided us. You know, so I hope that you will each take a look at what your landscape looks like. Who are the people that went before you? Reach out, connect with them, learn, because that's gold. When you pass those stories on, that is absolute gold that goes from generation to generation. And I can see that path that I followed from that little kid listening to my grandmother talk about the Trail of Tears, as she had heard from all those who went before her about how that happened. The split in our tribe that enabled the United States to win. What Alex said is true. Chief John Ross fought every inch of the way. He didn't go to war, he went to court. And we won. In a Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that Cherokees are a distinct community with borders and government and people of their own, and Georgia has no power over them. And Jackson became the only president so far in the history of America to open by the Supreme. Supposedly, he said, Justice Marshall made his decision, let him enforce it. And to the Georgians, he said, light a fire and they'll move. And it was that violence that convinced that one small faction of the tribe to give the U.S. the treaty that they wanted, because that violence was horrendous. But that split in our unity caused 7 years of civil war. From the time the end of the trail happened in 1839, and peace was finally made between the two in 1846. So you have stories, and those are the golden things that you can pass on. One of the stories that I really love came to me from a very remarkable man. In 2003, the phone rang. I answered it. I had refused to get caller ID. So when the phone rang, I just answered it. It was the White House. The George W. Bush White House. And they were calling because First Lady Laura Bush had continued a practice that began when she was the governor's wife in Texas, that of a national food festival. And they were going to be having it, as they always did, the first in October. And would I come tell stories at the National Food Festival? I was thrilled. And then the aide, Mrs. Bush's aide on the phone said, oh, and by the way, you'll be speaking on the opening night gala with Bob Sheeper, Tom Clancy, and Julie Andrews. And it will be televised live on C-SPAN. Okay. And I knew everything that I had been learning, every step on this journey told me that this was not a time or an opportunity to tell a cute little rabbit story and get down. I wanted to do more. I've been studying the history of Indian delegates to Washington and what they had gone through to speak on behalf of their people. So I went up to the grounds, the South grounds, and I spoke to an elder there, a man named Benny Smith. Benny was the grandson of Redbird Smith, who at the time of allotment, the times when my grandmother was born, he revived our ancient Cherokee stomp dance traditions. And Benny was the recipient of, his brother Crosland was the head of the Browns then. Benny was very special though because he worked for young people. For many years, he was the guidance counselor at Haskell College. And so I went up to the Browns to talk with Benny. I wanted to put together something that would, because I was going to be speaking to the president, his wives, senators, representatives, cabinet officials, and 200 of the best writers and illustrators in the country. And so Benny taught ancient Cherokee teaching of the 4 directions and the 4 guardians who live in those places. How one covers intellectual pursuits, that's the white guardian of the north. The south guardian, the color is black and it's heart, deep emotion. The western guardian, whose color is yellow, governs wisdom, not just intellectual properties of the north, but true wisdom in the west. And each of those guardians, guardian of the east, the red, native people, guardians of the planet. And each of those guardians faces a cross, and that place in the center where you balance all 4 is that place where your spirit. And so Benny not only taught me the teaching, he taught me how to say the names of each of the guardians in Cherokee. And I asked the White House if it was okay if I brought our principal chief and our beautiful First Lady, Bob Gayle, as my guests. Chad had been testifying before congressional committees on one Indian issue after another, but he'd never even gotten so much as a phone call from the Bush administration. So he and Bobby Gayle were happy to join. And I put together a whole little presentation starting with the way I introduced myself to you and talking about our history and our stories and how they teach us what our ancestors went through so that we can be who we are. And then I close with Benny's teaching. And what Benny said was the most important thing to say to these people of power, which is that all Indian people could thrive and prosper if the United States would just respect our tribal song. President Bush was in the first row. His eyes rolled back in his head. And I couldn't help but wonder, was it the concept or the number of syllables? After it was over, we all got to eat at a big steak dinner there in the Library of Congress. And former General Coleman Powell came to our table and introduced himself. He shook my hand and he thanked me for coming. He said he appreciated what I had said. He thought it was Donald Rumsfeld, not some. This is a story I learned from Benny. Benny gave me this, taught it to me. And he's gone now. So whenever I tell his story, I think he's with me just for a minute. You see, a long time ago, in a small Cherokee village, there lived 3 brothers. They were the sons of a woman, of the what we call beloved. And even though their father had died when they were young, and their mother had no brothers, uncles usually raised their sister children. Still, she was a wise and brave woman, and she raised those boys with the best of her heart. Now, as they grew old, the oldest brother became dissatisfied with the life that he had in his village. Something in him pulled for him to travel and see the world. And he went to his mother and said, "Mother, make for me the brown cornmeal, the traveling food. I want to go out and see the world." And the mother said, "Well, I can make the traveling food for you, but son, stay one more night. If you are leaving my house tomorrow, there are things I would like to tell you, things I think you should know." But he was just make the cornmeal and I'll leave. Now the oldest boy took his 2 younger brothers and they went to the river to go to water. Going to water is how a good Cherokee starts their day. Facing east, splashing water, running water from a river, a creek, or a stream over yourself 7 times, saying a good morning prayer to grandmother's son as she rises. Well, it was almost the middle of the day, but still the brother wanted to go with his younger brothers one more time, go to water. And as they did, the older boy said, "Now, a year from now, if I am not back, you come here again and go to water. And if the water turns red from the blood that is dripping from your nose, you will know that I'm in trouble." And the 2 younger brothers said, "Well, if that were ever to happen, of course we would come and find you." And so they went back, and the mother gave the boy the pouch of brown cornmeal, and he set off down the trail. But of course it was afternoon when he left, and he really hadn't gone very far at all, and he saw an older gentleman sitting beside the trail. As he prepared to walk past him, the old man called, "Grandson, would you have any food? It's been many days since I have eaten." And the boy said, "I have the pouch of brown cornmeal that my mother made for me, but I do not know how long I'll be traveling. I need that for myself." And the old man said, "Go in peace." And the boy continued down that path. But as the sun was setting and the forest was getting dark, he saw fire, a campfire up ahead. And thinking there were people camping by the trail and he might join them, he followed that path, but the fire was not burning beside the trail. It was burning in the yard of a house, and a young, beautiful woman was standing at the gate of the fence around the house. This was the most beautiful young woman the boy had ever seen. And she called to him. She said, "Stay, I will cook for you. It's getting dark. You can stay in my house and go on your way again in the morning." And dazzled by her beauty, the boy agreed. Now, as he passed her coming through the gate, she handed him a small, smooth stone. She said, "Put that in your medicine pouch. And the boy did. And she cooked for him. And he spent the night in that house. But when the sun rose in the morning, there was no food for him. There was an angry woman with a ferocious face, and the boy was frightened and made to run through the door. And she said, "Stay, eat with me." But he kept running. And she called after him, "You will only fall ill." And as he ran through the gate, there was great stone in his medicine pouch exploded. And the boy fell to the ground like this. And the old woman gathered him up and put him in a great wooden box in her house. Now, a year later, the two sons went to the river as their brother had told them, and sure enough, when they splashed the water over their face, their noses began to bleed. And the second son went back to the house and said, "Mother, our brother is in trouble. I must go to him. Make for me the brown corn." And the mother said, "I can make your traveling food, but stay one more night. Leave tomorrow morning. Let me spend the evening in the hothouse. Be posted. There are things you should know that I can teach you." But the second son was as impatient as his brother. As soon as the cornmeal was made, he set off down that same path, and he saw that same old. And the old man said, "Grandson, do you have any food?" The second son said, "Well, I have the brown cornmeal my mother made for me, but my brother is in trouble. I do not know how long I have to travel. I need it for myself." And the old man said, "Grandson, go in peace." And like his brother, he came to the place where that fire burned in the yard of that house. And the beautiful young woman at the gate called to him. And dazzled as his brother had been, he walked right through the gate. She handed him that smooth stone, said, "Put that in your nose and out." And he did. And like his brother, he ate her food. He spent the night in her house. And when he woke up, that beautiful young woman was gone. There was a raging, ferocious woman with a hate-filled face at him. And like his brother, he was frightened. He ran as fast as he could, and when he got to the gate, there was a terrible pop as the stone exploded, and he fell to the ground. The woman put his body next to that of his brother. Next year, the youngest boy went to water, and his nose began to bleed. He went back and told his mother what had happened, and that he had to go look for the two brothers. And his mother said, "I will make the brown cornmeal, but stay, spend the night with me in the hot house. There are things I want to teach you." And the youngest son agreed. "I will leave tomorrow morning, mother. If there's something you want to teach me, I want to hear it." And so they spent the night of sea. And the mother taught him all the things that she knew about how to be a good, kind, and passionate man. And in the morning, with the pouch of brown cornmeal hanging from his belt, he went down that same path as his brothers. He saw the old man, and he didn't even wait for the old man to call to him. He said, "Grandfather, grandfather, are you hungry? I have food. And so they ate. And the old man told him what had happened to his brother. He said, I've got something to help you with. And he handed the boy a little flute. And he taught him how to blow and when. So the boy kept on down that path, and when he saw the fire burning in the old woman's yard, he walked up to her, and like his brother, she said, I will cook for you. You can stay the night here. And as they walked through the gate, the old woman handed him that small, smooth stone and said, put that in your medicine pouch. But the boy only pretended to put it in his pouch. He kept it in his hand. And as they walked by the fire, he threw the stone into the flames, and there was a great pop. The woman said, what was that? And the boy said, I think it was a tree branch that cracked. So he went into the house with her, but he would not eat her. He ate the cornmeal his mother had made for him. He would not sleep in the place where she slept. He slept on the floor in the front room by the door. And in the morning, when he got up and saw that ferocious woman, he began to run. And the old woman shrieked when he did not fall at the gate, and grabbing a big knife, she came running after her. And as the old man had told him, the boy lifted the flute to his lips and blew it. Out of the air came a bear, a lion, a wolf, and a Cherokee dragon. They fell on the woman and tore her to pieces. And the boy went into her house and opened that box, and his brothers stepped out of that box, warm and alive. The boy told them what had happened and said, go home, our mother misses you so dreadfully. I'm going to travel for a while. And so the older brothers went home, and the boy went out into the world, and the good that he did would take many stories to tell. But at last he came to a village where a woman was chief, and the people were running everywhere, crying and wailing and moaning. And he said, what has happened here? And the people said, there is a great two-headed giant that has been seen coming this way. And the heads say, he's coming for our beloved woman, for our chief, and we are frightened. The boy said, I think I can help. But they laughed at him because he was so weak. So he went and he found that chief. And he told her that he thought he could help. Would she trust him? And something about his face and his eyes made the woman chief trust him and be safe with him. And she said, let us walk out of the trail, out onto the trail, to keep him away from the people of my village. And so they sat themselves in the path. And when they saw that two-headed giant coming toward them, lifted the flute to his lips and blew. And out of the air came the bear and the lion and the wolf and the great Cherokee Nation. And they fell on that giant and tore him to pieces. And the people from the village came running and said, "You have saved our beloved woman. We will have a feast for you. We will have a festival for you." And the boy turned to the woman chief and said, "Let me go home and get my brothers. I would like to have them here for that." And the woman chief agreed, but before the boy left, she said, "Let me comb your hair for you." And she ran her fingers through his long hair. Little knife, she cut a piece of hair and kept it. And the boy went home and saw his mother and told her, "Make 3 identical sets of clothes," because now you see he was as big as his older brothers, and when they were dressed exactly alike, they looked like identical triplets. They picked out 3 horses, exact same markings, and they traveled back to that village. And the people were confused when they saw the young men come riding into the village. Who is the one? Who is the one who saved our beloved one? And the brothers in unison said, "I am that." And so they sat down and the feast began. But the woman, she was running her fingers through their long hair. And she found the place where she had cut a lock of that boy's hair. And she leaned over and she said, "Why don't you want the people to know it was you?" And the boy said, "I would never have made my journey if my brothers had not made their journey." So you see, they saved your village every much as much as I did, because each of us stands on the shoulders of the ones who have gone before. Oh, well, I really over, but I just have to say a quick thank you to Anne and Alex. Without the 2 of you, I would not have made my journey. And I just want you both to know how much I appreciate this opportunity and how much I appreciate all of you for spending your afternoon here with all of us. Storytime. Thank you.
That's perfect timing, and I want to leave some time here for questions, or as I say in my classroom, questions, comments, or connections. And I also want to thank all of our tellers. I think we can do it in all of the Native Nations languages from whom we've heard today. So Cherokee, thank you, is Wado. In Abenaki, it's Uliuni. Or Kuchiuni for great thanks. In Darragans, it's Kutapatush, right? Here's girl, Kutapatush. Thank you. Yes. Kutapatush. And in the language of Louise, who is still with us on Zoom, the Dawnland Nation, it's Musicho. Excellent. So, I'll facilitate questions. Bethany, let me know if anybody on Zoom has anything for us. If there's anybody here in the audience. Praying about us.
Well, we told it all.
I guess.
They go along.
Well, great. All right. I'll leave you time to chat amongst yourselves. I do have a request for you. In the digital program, there's a link to a Google survey to provide feedback. Since this event was funded for us by New Hampshire Humanities, they get their funding from National Endowment for the Humanities. They really want us to collect some good feedback. So I'm going to send an email to reminder to you, but please do that, both you in the room and you on Zoom. That would be great. And thanks so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Yeah.